go ahead and start our evening program tonight to make sure that we have more than enough time for questions for General Rees. Let me go ahead and formally introduce our guest speaker tonight. Major General Fred Rees is the Chief of Staff for both Headquarters North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, and United States Northern Command. He serves in a dual-hatted position he assumed on May 12th of last year. General Rees began his military career in the United States Army as a West Point cadet in July 1962, and after graduating from West Point, he held a succession of prestigious active duty and Army National Guard positions, including, and I'm just taking a slice off the top, service in Vietnam as a cavalry troop commander, commander of the 116th Armored Cavalry Regiment, nearly 9 years as Adjutant General of Oregon, which is the most senior Guard position in the state, Director of the Army National Guard, over 5 years as Vice Chief of the National Guard Bureau, and 14 months as Acting Chief of the National Guard Bureau. And those of you who have any military experience recognize the tremendous significance of the National Guard Bureau as it fits into our military structure. General Rees is a much decorated officer, and although I won't read them all, his awards and decorations include the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, both the Army and the Air Force Distinguished Service Medals, and the Legion of Merit with 103 Plus. Finally, I should mention that General Rees is not only a distinguished military officer, but he also is somewhat unique in that he holds a law degree from the University of Oregon. And so I gather we won't be hearing any bad lawyer jokes tonight. Without further ado, would you join me in welcoming to the podium Major General Fred Rees.
Well, it's a delight to be with you. Thanks for that warm introduction. No, there will not, or yes, there will not be any lawyer jokes this evening. I think my only claim to be a lawyer is I have a degree and I send my dues in every year to the Oregon State Bar Association. So I'm not even going to pretend to have anything beyond those credentials. But it is a great delight to be here and to be with you and to recognize the significance of this conference. And certainly it sounds from the information that I've received that everybody is enjoying this and gaining a great deal from the conference. As an officer that serves as the Chief of Staff at NORAD and NORTHCOM, I'm immersed in the business of defending both of our homelands, Canada and the United States. And I find it very fascinating that how this construct has been put together and how it plays out on a day-to-day basis. And certainly I had the opportunity to be in here for the luncheon discussion and enjoyed that immensely. And it caused me to think about this particular story that I want to share with you. This is when God created Canada. On the sixth day, God turned to the angel Gabriel and said, "Today I am going to create a land called Canada. It will be a land of outstanding natural beauty. It shall have tall, majestic mountains full of mountain goats and eagles, and beautiful, sparkling lakes bountiful with fish. There shall be forests full of elk and moose, high cliffs overlooking sandy beaches with an abundance of sea life, and rivers stocked with salmon." And God continued, "I shall make the land rich in oil, so to make the inhabitants prosper. And I shall call these inhabitants Canadians, and they shall be known as the most friendly people on earth." The Lord asked Gabriel, "Don't you think you're being too generous to these Canadians?" And God replied, "No, not really. Just wait and see the neighbors I'm going to do." And so I thought that fit in pretty well. But on a more serious note, I think it's useful to start my discussion this evening with a historical perspective of the Canadian-U.S. partnership in military operations. You know, if you went back to the early part of the 20th century, World War I raged in Europe for more than 3 years before the United States sent troops to assist our allies. Canadian infantrymen were on the Western Front as early as January 1915. More than 35,000 American citizens rallied to the cause, joining the Canadian forces in Europe before our nation entered the war. One of these was Fred Gillette of Baltimore, Maryland, who trained as a pilot in Canada, then flew with the Royal Flying Corps in France, who was credited with 20 victories, second only to Eddie Rickenbacker's 26 among American citizens. By the way, the top Canadian ace was Lieutenant Colonel Billy Bishop from Owen Sound, Ontario. He was known as the Lone Hawk, and as he was called at that time. And he, when you combine Gillette and Rickenbacker's total and increase it by half, he was responsible for shooting down something like 72 aircraft. So quite a record. But the tradition of cross-border enlistment continued in World War II, with more Americans joining the Canadian forces and vice versa. We also fought in combined operations from the invasion of North Africa through the entry into Berlin. One of the most distinguished units in World War II was a combined U.S.-Canadian Special Operations Unit known as the 1st Special Service Force. The Germans call that the Devil's Brigade. This relationship continued throughout the latter part of the 20th century, Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf, and in peacekeeping operations in the Sinai, the Balkans, and in Haiti. The U.S. and Canadian forces have shed blood, sweat, and tears together. It is interesting to note that 52 Canadians hold the United States Medal of Honor. One of them currently lives in Colorado, Peter Lemon, formerly from Toronto, and he earned this in Vietnam and Tay Ninh province when he saved many of his comrades in a situation where they were being overrun by the Viet Cong. Now, we are looking at this past relationship, at the success that we've had both in NATO, where we've been part of a great alliance, one of history's most successful peace movements, as we'd like to say, and what transpired there. And we are building on the incredible foundation of mutual support as we face the current asymmetric threat of terrorism. We are engaged in military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, which is the away game against terrorists. At their height, Canadian forces in these regions have involved more than 3,400 people, the fourth largest contribution to the international coalition. We are also fighting the good fight together on our continent through organizations such as the one that I belong to, NORAD, and a recent addition to our organization and our oversight is what's known as the Binational Planning Group. Now, as I mentioned, NORAD and NORTHCOM, and it was mentioned in my introduction here, that I am the Chief of Staff at both of these organizations, North American Aerospace Defense Command and U.S. Northern Command. They are two distinct commands, but you find that for reasons of efficiency, getting the job done, there are a lot of people that are wearing two hats. They're both located in Colorado Springs and are both commanded by the dual-hatted four-star commander, Ed Eberhard, a U.S. Air Force general. NORAD is a Canadian-U.S. binational organization responsible for aerospace warning and aerospace control of North America. Since 1958, Canadians and Americans have been partners in protecting the airspace of Alaska, Canada, and the contiguous 48 United States. That's 46 years come this May, 46 years of working together to make NORAD function and make it successful. And it's a very, I think this is a sophisticated and very mature organization as opposed to U.S. Northern Command, which is very, very new because it started as a result of the events of 11 September 2001. Now, NORAD's focus since 11 September 2001 was almost exclusively, prior to September 11, 2001, NORAD's focus was almost exclusively focused on outside threats inbound to Canadian and American borders. After September 11th, NORAD's focus increased to include watching air traffic within the domestic airspace of both Canada and the United States. NORAD's fighter presence, both in the air and on alert, has been increased across the continent. We've been flying irregular patrols, predominantly over United States cities, since September 11th, 2001. We've flown more than 34,000 sorties and have diverted air patrols or scrambled fighters at more than 1,700 intercepts during the same period of time. And more than 75% of the pilots that are flying those F-15s and F-16s on the U.S. side are Guard and Reserve, and we are joined in this effort by the Canadian Forces F-18s. We're proud to say that our citizen soldiers, citizen airmen, are living up to the proud traditions that have been established here in this continent before the birth of both of our countries. Now, the President and Secretary of Defense implement the national military strategy through unified commands that are organized either functionally, such as those that we see in Illinois in what's known as TRANSCOM or Transportation Command, or up north of here in Norfolk, U.S. Joint Forces Command. Or on a regional basis, around the world, we have other organizations known as Pacific Command, Southern Command, or the one that you see every day in the news, Central Command, that's responsible for what goes on in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these are geographic combatant commands. But President Bush directed the military response to the attacks here in the domestic United States, the response to those attacks, through a number of separate commands. And the decision was made that America needs to look at how we do this and to create a U.S. Northern Command. And so when the initiatives were taken following 9/11, the decision was to go through perhaps the largest reorganization since the creation of the Department of Defense in 1947. And that's the restructuring that created the Department of Homeland Security to take care of civilian agencies, and within the Department of Defense to create U.S. Northern Command to ensure that the military defense of the United States was properly handled and to coordinate the total force efforts toward that end. Now, we were established on October the 1st, 2002, and U.S. Northern Command shares defense responsibilities with the other unified commands that I mentioned to you. Our responsibilities include defense of the continental United States, Alaska, Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Gulf of Mexico, and in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans with approximately 500 miles, within 500 miles of our shoreline. Additionally, U.S. Northern Command works cooperatively with Canada and Mexico. Their close cooperation and coordination are essential for the defense of the continent. And as a practical matter, the defense mission with regard to Canada is reflected in our mutual defense agreements. Our respective nations are reviewing and updating these agreements through the binational planning group and also through the auspices of the North American Aerospace Defense Command. And I'm going to discuss that a little bit in more detail as I go on. So for the first time since the time of George Washington and the Continental Army, the United States has a military command that focuses solely on homeland defense and support to homeland security. And President Bush emphasized the importance of this mission when he said, "As members of our military, you will stand between American citizens and grave danger, you will stand between civilization and chaos, and you will stand for liberty, tolerance, and truth, the ideals of America and the hopes of the entire world." Now, in order to accomplish its missions, U.S. Northern Command maintains a unique and extensive interagency involvement with other departments and agencies of the government at the federal, state, and local levels, as well as contact with non-governmental agencies. Now, this is an important point to remember, that when the President or the Secretary of Defense directs U.S. Northern Command to provide military support to civil authorities, it will almost always be in a supporting role to the primary federal agency in charge of the overall operation. Now, a few years ago, Bruce Willis played a Special Forces general in a movie entitled The Siege. Instead of providing support to civilian law enforcement agencies during a terrorist incident in New York, Willis's character usurped the authority of the civilians and trampling all over the Constitution in the process. And I think this is an excellent example of what we do not do at U.S. Northern Command. Now, it may make for a dramatic tension in a movie, but it's antithetical to the role that we play in our society. So U.S. Northern Command has provided extensive support to civil authorities in its short life. And some of these I think you would recognize. The ricin contamination that was occurred in the Senate office building earlier this year. The last fall, Hurricane Isabel and California wildfires that took place. And then the unfortunate tragedy of the Columbia shuttle and the recovery operations that took place about a year ago. All of those required our assistance, and Northern Command was able to participate appropriately and successfully in seeing those through to the right conclusions. Now, we bring the relevant military capabilities and instruments to bear in each and every one of these circumstances. But again, I want to note that we typically do this in relationship to a lead federal agency, and be that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, in the case of the shuttle, NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, or in the case of wildfires, for instance, that was through NIFC, the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. All of those we are very well tied into, and we have well over, I think it's close to 60 representatives from these various national agencies that work with us on a routine basis. Now, in the weeks that followed the events of September 11, 2001, U.S. and Canadian officials discussed means of improving the safety and security of citizens through enhanced cooperation within North America. And these discussions resulted in an agreement to enhance Canada-U.S. security cooperation by establishing a binational planning group. Now, under this temporary agreement, both countries are working together on contingency plans for defending against and responding to possible threats in Canada and the United States, including natural disasters and potential terrorist attacks. The objective of the arrangement is to work out the details of a coordinated response in advance of a potential crisis. Cross-border support shouldn't be a sandlot pickup game, nor should it be an event where we meet in a business meeting for the first time and exchange our business cards. So the binational planning group is an effective arrangement that makes sense for both countries. It takes advantage of existing infrastructure and expertise that's in Colorado, within NORAD and within the U.S. Northern Command headquarters. And we believe in the event of crisis, it's going to save lives. So the binational planning group will improve current U.S. and Canadian arrangements to defend against the maritime threats to the continent and to respond to land-based attacks should they occur. The binational planning group also enhances both countries' response to natural disasters by promoting well-coordinated binational support to civilian authorities. Closer cooperation in terms of shared threat assessments, planning, and exercises will help prevent potential attacks and mitigate their impact should they occur. There are no standing forces assigned to the binational planning group. Rather, the binational planning group is focusing on contingency planning by examining possible threat scenarios that have implications on both sides of the border. The activities include improving contingency efforts to ensure a cooperative and well-coordinated response to national requests for military assistance in the event of a threat, attack, or civil emergency in the United States or Canada. It will involve how to coordinate maritime surveillance and intelligence sharing to enhance our overall awareness of potential maritime threats. It includes assuring that we can assess maritime threats, incidents, and emergencies, and advise the two governments appropriately. And it includes establishing appropriate planning and liaison mechanisms with civil authorities involved in that crisis response, such as police, firefighters, and first responders. And overall, I think involved in this is a very significant, robust exercise program. Now, this binational planning group is located at Peterson Air Base in order to take advantage of that existing infrastructure that I mentioned to you previously. It is headed by a Canadian, Lieutenant General Rick Findlay, who heads this. He works with an American deputy, Lieutenant General Ed Anderson. Their respective jobs, I've mentioned this dual-hatted business that Lieutenant General Findlay is also the deputy commander of NORAD. Lieutenant General Anderson is the deputy commander of U.S. Northern Command. Lieutenant General Findlay is responsible to both governments, and he reports to the Canadian government through the Chief of Defense Staff, and he works through General Everhart, our commander at Northern Command and NORAD, as the point of contact for consultation with the United States government. Now, the Canadian and U.S. governments jointly direct this binational planning group. Both countries will exercise their independent sovereign rights to approve or reject the proposed plans when they're completed. We also have, in conjunction with this group, representatives from Canada's Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. They're involved in this. This is Canada's organization that's similar to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. And we also, of course, have the U.S. representative of FEMA that's there to participate in this planning effort. It was organized, this binational planning group was organized for a 2-year period, which is to take us through December 2004. Now, the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and the U.S. Department of State are currently discussing an extension of the charter of this organization so that they can take advantage of the expertise that's been developed here. And we're looking at further improvements in the current NORAD agreement, which has to be reviewed and completed prior to 2006. So we think that marrying up these two efforts will be very beneficial. Some of the binational planning group's accomplishments to date, including a lot of effort in the maritime area and looking at how to improve binational awareness of what we call vessels of interest to both countries and sharing information on these vessels of interest and what assets are available to deal with these potential threats to both countries. They have developed 8 consequence management scenarios that are focused on weapons of mass destruction, terrorists and natural disasters, and they're developing a civil assistance plan to go with these 8 scenarios. They are also reviewing and revising documents that form the core of our binational security cooperation, the basic security document and the combined defense plan, among numerous others that they're looking at. So in just a little over a year of its existence, I think they've helped tremendously to better position both Canada and the U.S. to deal with the maritime threat and with the potential terrorist attacks or natural disasters in either country. And with the probable extension of their charter, our nations, I believe, will be able to refine the excellent work that has been accomplished so far. Now, I began my comments with the rich history of mutual support that our countries share. So let me conclude by putting a personal face on that relationship. David Barkway was a 34-year-old executive with BMO Nesbitt Burns in Toronto. He and his pregnant wife, Cindy, and their 2-year-old child visited New York on a 3-day business trip in September 2001. David was visiting a client on the 105th floor of the North Tower of the World Trade Center when the first plane hit. He sent an email to his Toronto colleague saying he was in trouble and asking for help. And that was his last contact. David is one of 24 Canadians who died in the attack on the World Trade Center. Beulah Cooper lives in Gander, Newfoundland, and on September 11th, she turned her home into a bed and breakfast for total strangers, many from the United States. It was on that day that more than 6,700 passengers on 89 airliners descended on the Gander airport, nearly doubling the population of Gander and the surrounding towns and villages. Beulah is, I think, characteristic of Canadians who rose to the challenge of caring for neighbors, and they were caught up in a life-changing moment because of these terrorist attacks. On her dining room table in Gander lies a collection of Christmas cards, notes from passengers who took showers in her home, drove her car, who shopped while she watched their children, and many, many thank yous, including one that's from the O'Rourke's, whose son was a New York firefighter who died when the towers fell. So there you have it. We are neighbors, friends, and allies. And on a personal note, I would tell you, both in my personal situation here, that both my parents had grandparents that were Canadian citizens. My wife's father was born and raised in Canada, so a lot of this is very personal to me. And there's almost nothing that I think that happens to one nation that doesn't affect the other, particularly in the area of national security. So as we face the challenges that lie ahead, let us recall the spirit with which our fathers and grandfathers met and overcame past threats. I think that spirit's caught in these words from Prime Minister Trudeau that he made back in 1981 to a joint session of the Parliament. And he spoke to acknowledge the contributions made by the 1st Special Service Force in World War II. He said, "The 1st Special Service Force made no distinctions as it went into battle. Its men had the common cause of freedom and common denominator of courage was in their hearts. They were neither Canadian nor American. They were, in General Eisenhower's term, liberators." So they may have been liberators in World War II, but they're certainly partners in the defense of North America in the 21st century. And we at NORAD and U.S. Northern Command and those of us that are associated with the Binational Planning Group continue to press ahead to see to it that we are doing our very best for the citizens of both Canada and the United States. It's been a pleasure to be with you here this evening, and I look forward to taking some questions.
So I would ask you, if you have a further question for General Rees, if you would please stand, identify yourself, and speak as loudly as you can.
I'm Joseph Job. General, we've been following the 911 Commission's investigations of the intelligence agencies and the White House, but the Commission has also taken an interest in what occurred in Colorado Springs. Could you please tell us about what specifically the Commission has been interested in, how you have responded, and what you are expecting in the Commission's report concerning NORAD and air defense operations?
Certainly. First of all, General Everhart has assured that whatever the Commission wants, the Commission gets it, and we have provided volumes of material, and certainly any individual that was necessary for testimony or otherwise has access to them has been assured. There's been a great deal of focus in particular on those aspects of what went on in our warning center, whether it was in Cheyenne Mountain at the operations center there, or out at the sector at the Northeastern Air Defense Command in New York. And certainly a lot of scrutiny going over the logs, the recordings of the various conversations that took place between these sectors and command posts, either to the pilots themselves or between these organizations at the FAA or on up the chain of command. And I would say that as we've gone through this, we have learned a lot about improving our relationships, say, with the FAA. We currently have FAA representatives not only at the sector level, but also in Cheyenne Mountain. In the intelligence arena, I can't speak to that particular issue. I don't have any personal knowledge on that. But my impression is that given the circumstances and what we knew at the time in our command, we were meeting requirements appropriately. And as I think I said this earlier, the way that we were set up at that juncture, at that point in our history, we're looking externally. Our radars and everything that we're using at that juncture, we're looking outward. And because of this, we have obviously turn and have a better relationship now with the FAA so that we are also looking at the internal air traffic of the United States.
General, Steve Staples from Blair's Institute. It's been argued quite persuasively, I think, in Canada, the Canadian government, that should Canada decide not to join the U.S. missile defense program, that NORAD can cease to exist. You've outlined some, I think, some important functions, additional functions post 9/11 that NORAD needs to provide. How do you see that happening should the Canadian government decide not to participate? How does NORAD shut down, and how do those important functions carry on?
Well, it is a very significant issue, and certainly one that is delicate. It's very clear from the policy of the United States that we are going to move on with missile defense. And if you look at how we are integrated in NORAD, we have, as I already mentioned, at NORAD we have General Everhart is the commander. We have the deputy as a Canadian general officer. We have the reverse of that in Canada. We have in the Canadian Air Defense region, or a Canadian in charge, we have a deputy who is a U.S. officer. And you'll find the same kind of thing throughout our structure. So we're going to have to be able to make some kind of accommodation if the Canadian government is not going to go along with this on missile defense, that we're going to have to come up with a way to proceed so that the United States can conduct missile defense regardless. So it is tough, and it means that we're going to have to change our way. Will that mean that the demise of NORAD? I don't believe so. I think that NORAD has a significant role to play with the air breathing threat and with all of the other things that I've mentioned here. And I think there's also the potential downstream that you could see. Many people ask us, well, what's the difference between U.S. Northern Command and NORAD? U.S. Northern Command is U.S. only, NORAD is binational. And as General Everhart likes to describe this, he says, think about this in terms of, say, Europe, where you have NATO, multinational, and you have European Command, which is U.S. only. And that he sees that as we develop this and continue our partnership, we would hope that we would take on, perhaps through the auspices of this binational planning group, looking at the maritime situation and other aspects of this, a more all-encompassing type of relationship. Unfortunately, it would appear that a segment of this that wouldn't threaten the potential of it, but would limit it, is this business about disagreement on missile defense. Please.
Mike Myers, Duke University. As the Joint Planning Group does its work, presumably you're going to be envisaging scenarios that might extend to American land or sea forces operating Canadian territory, or perhaps even Canadian forces operating American territory. Are you also contemplating the assignment of operational command over those forces to one or the other country's armed forces for separate periods of time?
I think that's a potential part of the discussion, but we're kind of in this crawl part of the crawl, walk, run business, and I think that's a discussion for downstream. We're working on very, I would say, much more rudimentary relationships. And in the case of NORAD proper, we have certainly tried to maintain relationships that protect the sovereignty of each of the areas. So we have this Canadian Air Defense region with the Canadian commander. I would say that General Everhart and the commanders preceding him have been very, very sensitive to this to try to promote the idea that or protect the sovereignty of each of the nations. Please.
General Don at Cleveland University. You've given the impact and the capability of Canadians to be able to function alongside their U.S. allies, our U.S. allies, and to do the things that are necessary when the time comes. Because the Canadians had shut down, the Canadian officers had shut down the old air traffic system in North America at that time. Is there any reason why this is not understood or played out a little bit better because of the circumstances we now face in trying to go forward?
Well, I think that's a great observation. I can't say that there is any deliberate reason that it's not advertised or made note of. I think it is a great example of cooperation. I think the longer I'm associated with this, the more amazed I am at the level of integration and cooperation. So whether it's, as you mentioned, Tyndall, Cheyenne Mountain, we have in most of our warning centers, be it the Beale Air Force Base or elsewhere, we also have a large number of Canadians there, and they are very, very effective at what they're doing and fully trusted and included what's going on. We're talking about with the security of the United States and vice versa in Canada. So I think it is something that we should take up, and I'm going to take that message back to our public affairs people and see if there isn't some way to make that more common as far as knowledge is in both countries. Please.
General David Holton, CDC. I'm not here in a journalistic capacity, so I'm strictly off the record. I know here. We were discussing earlier whether some kind of creative fudge-like compromise could be found for Canada to join ballistic missile defense, just as it relates to land and sea-based systems, and somehow divorce itself from any of the potential space-based systems involved. Do you see that as a realistic compromise? And secondly, I mean, apart from the obvious sentimental and symbolic values of having Canada in missile defense and the efficiency of using NORAD as the framework to run it, does it really matter that much to the U.S. whether Canada?
I think we're starting to get echelons above my pay grade here. From a NORAD perspective, certainly, as I tried to indicate earlier, we will have to proceed, if Canada doesn't participate, we're going to have to proceed somehow with missile defense regardless. On the other hand, if you recognize the way we are integrated, it is going to be a great burden to try to sort this out if we have to somehow separate some sub-element of NORAD so that there is a U.S.-only capacity in the missile defense business. So I think it's, from an efficiency perspective, the military efficiency perspective, it's to our advantage to integrate. I think that people need to be better educated about space and its effect on war on the planet Earth. Whether it's a Canadian military element that's in Afghanistan or a U.S. element that's in Iraq or whatever it may be, there are going to be requirements there that we're going to save soldiers' lives, make them more efficient, more capable, and so on, if we use the satellite capabilities and so on that are in space. So the idea that somehow we are not going to be using space for military purposes, I think is a personal opinion of mine, that is difficult to say, no, this is never going to happen, or we're going to prevent this from happening, because it is already happening, and it provides tremendous advantages to those individuals that are using those platforms. So I think it would be helpful if there were more open dialogue about what this means, as opposed to saying we are not going to use space to to support things that are going on here on terra firma. I hope that's some place in the neighborhood of what you're looking for as far as.
John Rees, we want to thank you very much, sir, for joining us tonight, to being our keynote speaker for the evening. We've certainly explained Northcom and the relationship between Northcom and NORAD. And interestingly, if you've looked at the program, our very first panel tomorrow morning at 8:30 is on NORAD-Northcom interoperability issues. So that will certainly follow on to your comments. But please join me in thanking General Rees. Again, we invite you to stay as long as you'd like this evening to enjoy the fellowship. And I'm sure that the bar in the hotel is open for those of you who are interested in further drinks. But if you do not, we look forward to seeing you. The continental breakfast will be served again tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and our program will start at 8:30. Have an enjoyable evening. Thank you.